It's difficult to talk about Metroid Fusion without also talking about Super Metroid. Fusion carried the burden of living up to the colossal expectations set by Super Metroid's legendary reception and legacy. I said in my previous video that Super is seen not only as the pinnacle of its genre, but also the perfect or near-perfect Metroid game. Nintendo's R&D 1 decided that the best way to build on Super Metroid was to design an entire game around distancing itself from Super's greatest achievements. Regardless of whether or not you like Metroid Fusion, there's no denying that this decision was bold. Super was a more open experience with concealed guidance, some disguised linearity combined with a focus on freedom and player agency. Fusion prides itself on restricting the player and offering a more story-focused experience with a deeper exploration of our player character. Familiar elements like sequence breaking, navigational freedom, and item progression are de-emphasized in favor of a more traditionally told story, with lots of dialogue and mission-focused progression. A Metroid game committing to distancing itself from the most highly regarded entry in the series does sound like a risky idea on paper. What does Metroid Fusion stand to gain from choosing this new direction? How does Metroid Fusion hope to escape Super Metroid's shadow? I think I was 11 years old when I first played Metroid Fusion. I remember coming home from a school field trip and I was randomly given the gift that I had been wanting all year. Game Boy Advance games were basically dirt cheap in 2011, so even though it wasn't my birthday or anything, I was handed a surprise copy of Metroid Fusion out of nowhere. I was surprised to receive it and so excited to try it out. I knew absolutely nothing about this game, other than that it was another Metroid game. I knew nothing of its status as a sequel to Super Metroid, nor did I go in with any expectations about its unique design quirks. I just played the game, and it was tough. I died plenty of times, lost a good amount, but eventually played it all the way to the end. I remember especially enjoying the atmosphere and gameplay, but I was just ecstatic to have yet another Metroid game to revisit constantly for years to come. For a while, this was my favorite 2D game in the series, but from the perspective of someone that replays these games countless times over the years, Fusion has since fallen to be around my third or fourth favorite 2D Metroid. Considering that Metroid is by far my favorite series of all time, I still see that as very high praise for it to place that high in my personal ranking. I'll go over why I like this game so much in this video, but I also want to take a good amount of time on examining the reputation surrounding this game as well. Similar to my video on Federation Force, there are plenty of people that seem to really hate this game, and I want to go over some of the common criticisms to generate some discussion. Fusion's art is nothing short of absolutely gorgeous. The amount of detail is so staggering. It's far more detailed than any of the previous games. I know that's not completely fair, given the obvious hardware advantage afforded by the Game Boy Advance, but Metroid Fusion is a great-looking game, even today, for all of its love and care placed into every sprite and tile. The first thing to address right away is the common criticism that the choice of color in this game often looks oversaturated. This is a common criticism levied against the visuals of this game. Others have covered this topic better than I can, but the gist of the situation is that the original Game Boy Advance alters the gamma value on its display screen, and the screen is also not backlit at all. It's not just that the console lacked a backlight, but it's also that the console literally changed the way the colors look on the screen. Developers of early GBA titles worked around this issue by oversaturating everything carefully, so that the output on the screen would average out to something that actually looks good. Many players seem unaware of this fact, and they just raw dog the colors on their PC emulators. Many seem to be under the impression that how they're seeing these games on emulators is just how they've always looked, even on original hardware. I am using RetroArch and MGBA to capture footage, since I don't own any means of recording straight off my Game Boy Advance. But I'm playing with a shader that better approximates the look of how this game would appear if played on original hardware. Many Game Boy Advance games basically require this color adjustment to look appealing, and it's unfortunate that so many players seem to be completely unaware of this color issue. As a result of this situation, I will not be criticizing Metroid Fusion's choice in colors. When played as the game was actually meant to look, the use of color is absolutely gorgeous. The colors really pop, but they still manage to fit the mood that the game is going for by balancing things out with darker colors as well. Sprite art is phenomenal, especially with larger bosses like the Nightmare, the SAX, or the Omega Metroid. Samus's close-ups and all of the artwork in general is completely unforgettable, and they all do a great job painting a nice detailed picture of the world and story. Samus's new suit design is emblematic of the shift in design philosophies found within this game, and I absolutely adore the way her power suit looks in Fusion. There are constant reminders that everything that you are seeing is just artificial. Environments to house creatures to be studied, and this adds a lot of unique elements to further separate these areas from possibly feeling generic. The main deck is a great example of how to make a space station like this feel more interesting. There are so many different aesthetics within this one level, so much variety and detail, that this ends up being one of the most memorable locations in the game. Everything from these windows showing the vastness of space, the decimated and mysterious quarantine bay, the work areas with bookcases and houseplants, the claustrophobic feeling of the ventilation shafts, the list goes on and on. It's certainly unlike what we've seen in previous Metroid games, but that makes it stand out even more for being so memorable and unique. The whole point is that it's meant to stand on its own, unique from what you've come to expect from the previous games. It manages to offer its own detailed recent history, and elevates the ongoing theme of everything about this game working towards unsettling you. Just because this setting isn't in ancient alien world, that doesn't therefore mean that this world lacks any history. It's just very recent history, which offers its own appeal. Fusion has plenty of dark areas that bring the mood down, but there are other areas that feel fairly well lit. You'd think that these areas would feel relatively safe as a result, but these areas can feel just as unsettling as the other areas of the game world. These areas are decorated with familiar and human-looking set dressing like plants, lab equipment, or other things you might expect to see on a space station. These areas aren't ancient lost civilizations, they are modern and relatively normal-looking comfortable areas. The problem is that they're completely empty, and the context surrounding them makes them some of the most unsettling places we've ever visited in a Metroid game. These levels may not allow you to speculate on lost civilizations, but the history of the BSL is recent, violent, and horrendous. Instead of speculating on what may have happened to an ancient unknown race, you're actively dealing with the greatest threat of the entire series that is happening in the here and now. It's kind of like the incredible tension of the series station realized into an entire game. You go through these areas, seeing their visuals, knowing what this place is supposed to be. It's supposed to be safe, it's supposed to be a comfortable place for normal humans. But it's become a slaughterhouse beyond your imagination, and the mysterious and unfathomable terror is still becoming more powerful. The narrative and greater context of the BSL synergize with the fantastic art to make this setting one of the most memorable places of the entire series. There's an unsettling flavor of liminality in wandering through something well lit, something meant to feel comforting, but the context of the greater situation at hand makes these areas feel eerie. BSL is a biological laboratory, and each of the sectors are different kinds of habitats for creatures from Zebes and SR388. You may suspect that the environments could fall victim to generic theming, like basic water level or fire level. The BSL benefits tremendously from its unique twist to these areas with the fact that they are artificial animal habitats with mechanical components blended into nearly every room. Sector 4 sets itself apart from other video game water levels for its unique take on this trope. It's a damaged marine lab with electric components submerged in flooded water. It also doubles as an oceanic habitat for otherworldly undersea creatures. Sector 2 features all kinds of exotic wildlife, with strange growths and creatures crawling along every surface. I especially enjoy the smaller details like the many twisting vines grabbing onto the metallic components of the environments. Sector 2 might not be anything too crazy at first, but I almost feel like that's on purpose so they can dial the aesthetic up to 11 when the vegetation begins to consume the entire sector. Sector 5 feels like a ginormous freezer. The giant doors in the background show hinges and huge handles, making me wonder about what kind of horrors might be housed inside. It stays interesting with things like its decimation and melting once the nightmare becomes X-infected. This endgame area with acid spilled onto the floors makes me wonder if the X have drained these nearby chemical vats to try to harm Samus. This place also might resemble Torian, an area whose purpose was to breed Metroids. It's connected to a simulation of the SR388 environment, the home of the Metroids, and a mysterious restricted zone. I won't go on, but there is just so much to the environments of Fusion that leave a strong intrigue even all of these years after my first playthrough. The environments are filled with even more detail than Super Metroid's world. Little details like the many water effects like ruptured tanks spilling in the background, splashing steps, and undersea waves. Tons of different kinds of plants everywhere growing in their simulated environments, heated distortion, and lights like a lizard's heat lamp in Sector 3, giant tanks with bubbling water, different kinds of lab equipment, metallic girders, frost all over Sector 5, and so much more. There is so much about Metroid Fusion that makes this game feel like a horror game more than any other game in the series. A lot of these ideas will come up as the video continues, but I'd like to just list some of the many reasons that Metroid Fusion is terrifying on screen for now. Metroid Fusion's linearity especially works wonders for the excellently horrendous atmosphere of this game. I'll get more into that later. Metroid Fusion's soundtrack is, again, a combination of tracks focused on connecting the music to the environments or emphasizing specific beats in the story. The choices in instrumentation match the aesthetics of the different environments with great care. Take the chimes used in Sector 5, giving the level a feeling of frozen stillness. Or Sector 3's cymbal and choirs complementing the oppressive heat of the level. The underlying hum in the music parallels heat waves pulsing in the environment. What's interesting is that despite being on the Game Boy Advance's limited sound hardware, this soundtrack often uses instrumentation sounding very much like real-world instruments, like drums, chimes, choir, cymbals, and bells. The game's soundtrack also places more focus on whatever is going on in the story rather than the environments, which elevates the story very well. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this new focus actively harms exploration, however. If you return to older levels between missions, you'll find that the music doesn't change back to that level's theme. These music tracks used between missions are often vague droning or atmospheric, so these tracks do not feel jarring or like they're trying to hurry you back to the story. Fusion's music tracks sound quite unique, and it's especially impressive that none of the tracks feel like they're held back by the limited sound capabilities of the Game Boy Advance. There's so much energy in Fusion's music, and it definitely embraces the more horror-like atmosphere that Fusion's all about. I know you've almost certainly heard this before, but these tracks masterfully blend melody and atmosphere in an unforgettable way. From here, I'm just going to let some of the tracks speak for themselves and play a few segments from some of my favorites. I'm not very well versed in music theory, so instead of taking my usual approach with discussing music, I'd prefer to move on to other topics. For what it's worth, all of the music is absolutely phenomenal. Metroid Fusion has my favorite soundtrack of the 2D Metroid games. The controls in Metroid Fusion are widely celebrated for ironing out the kinks from Super Metroid and streamlining the configuration to work on fewer buttons. For one, the run button has been outright removed. Instead of walking or running, Samus maintains a consistent jogging speed. I may not have been very fond of the run feature in Super Metroid, but I'm not necessarily against the concept itself. Fusion didn't seem to have much of a choice, seeing as the console only has 2 face buttons and 2 triggers. I felt like running was hardly interesting in Super, so I can't say I miss it. Sure, it may have offered some dynamic platforming opportunities here and there, but the level design rarely offered opportunity for this dynamic momentum to matter very much at all. Having a run button also offered its own drawbacks, such as the fact that my one thumb has to frequently press and hold 3 different face buttons down at one time. Fusion's simplicity here makes for a more consistent and comfortable control scheme. Super had an issue where I felt like your vertical acceleration was much faster than your horizontal acceleration, but Fusion fixes this with a much more consistent speed between the two. The jumping physics are more weighty, and your vertical and horizontal acceleration feel more balanced. This makes platforming just feel more intrinsically satisfying to master, and makes for a much tighter feeling moment-to-moment gameplay experience overall. One potential drawback of the new control scheme is that outside of the speed booster, that momentum with your running and jumping is absent. This is also true of every Metroid game that is not Super Metroid. Like I said before, I really don't think that Super Metroid offered much with its dynamic momentum that a speed boost jump can't also offer. The speed boosting jump does maintain some version of that dynamic momentum integrating into your platforming, and I feel like Fusion's level design uses this move more often than Super Metroid ever did. The spin jump in particular has been vastly improved with 2 big changes. The first is that the spin jump can be reinitiated simply by pressing the jump button in midair at any time. This outright removes the annoying moments where you are forced to sink to the ground just to get back into a spin. The second improvement is that the sensitive D-pad issue of accidentally canceling spins has been fixed. As long as you're holding left or right, you can hammer on up or down as much as you want, and Samus will never cancel her spin jump to take aim. It's basically impossible to accidentally cancel a spin jump now. If you do want to cancel a spin, just stop holding left or right and then press up or down. Space jump has also massively improved with far less picky timing. And even if you did somehow manage to accidentally cancel a spin jump, it hardly matters anymore because you can just press jump to get right back into a spin. So yeah, jumping feels far superior in Fusion. Item selection is similarly streamlined, as missiles are now toggled by holding the right trigger. They also repurposed super missiles as an upgrade to regular missiles, which helps keep missile expansions and missiles in general useful even in the late game. Holding R in the morph ball will toggle between bombs and power bombs now. Items like X-ray scope and grappling beam do not return in Fusion, so there's no more item selection menu to navigate in real time. Honestly, the grappling beam was pretty underwhelming and redundant with the space jump, so I don't really miss it here in Fusion. These changes make alternating between your equipable items remarkably intuitive and seamless. When you're using an item, you're immediately aware of what you have equipped. You don't have to take your eyes off of the action to check a menu at the top of the screen. You instantly know just by holding the R button. This improvement is so massive that I have a tough time going back to what came before a lot of the time. Ledge grabbing and ladder climbing are added to Samus's moveset, which both further diversify platforming. Platforming opportunities are expanded where instead of just jumping from platform to platform, you are now assessing the placement of ladders along the walls and ceilings, as well as jumping into ledges just to jump again from a ledge grab. There's more going on here because of these new moves, and it evolves platforming in Metroid to become the best platforming offering yet. The big controversial change to Metroid Fusion's control scheme is that single wall scaling and infinite bomb jumping have been outright removed. Restricting your progression is kind of the whole point of the game, and I'll get more into that topic later, but as far as the actual controls are concerned, this really isn't this huge deal. The improvements to the spin jump make this move far more consistent than it was in Super. The wall jump is far from useless just because it can't be used to sequence break. The opportunities for utilization are obviously way fewer than in Super, but this move is still very useful. It's still fun to integrate into your basic platforming, and it's great for gaining some extra high ground, maybe to dodge an enemy or reach a higher platform. The controls of Metroid Fusion are such a massive improvement in my eyes over any of the previous games. Sure, dynamic momentum can only be achieved through the speed booster, but again, Super Metroid barely did anything with its momentum outside of the speed booster, so I really don't see this as much of a downgrade at all, at least for me personally. The item selection is streamlined and the jumping controls are so much better with superior physics and some important tweaks to the spin jump. Controls are really important in a Metroid game, so I really appreciate what Fusion is able to accomplish here. Metroid Fusion's world is made of 7 different levels. 6 different sectors connect to the main deck in this hub area here. These individual sectors only connect to each other towards the very end of the game, and are otherwise entirely segmented. Visiting a sector will task you with something in that level, and you have to return to the level entrance before moving on to the next sector. What's interesting about this philosophy of nonlinear areas in a linear order is that some version of this philosophy has existed in games like any version of Metroid 2, Super's second half, Echoes, Corruption, or Other M. These areas have you completing levels one at a time, entering to complete some progression task and exiting back from the way you came to return to the main level. Splicing a Metroid world into 7 isolated segments has the expected consequence of making each of these levels feel slightly small. Like Metroid 2, the game is made more accessible and the game is given a more evenly paced adventure. Pathing options within each level are fairly non-linear, but the game is overall more linear than any mainline Metroid game. Metroid Fusion is more restrictive than Metroid usually is, but each level is still very maze-like and always features various pathways to take. You must solve the maze-like level design and complete various objectives that are never as simple as point A to point B. Especially since this world structure is so similar to Metroid 2, it's difficult for me to say much of anything new about the world design itself. Metroid Fusion's actual world design is segmented, but still sufficiently spaghetti-like to get yourself lost in. In terms of pathing options within each sector, it's about on par with Metroid 2's in that the pathing options start out fairly limited and gradually expand as you progress further in the game. Your progression and navigation change your approach to traversing this world, but the layout of the world itself is just as great as it was in Metroid 2. It even enjoys numerous benefits, such as late-game shortcuts that interconnect neighboring sectors for efficient traversal. Super Metroid's progression is basically unrecognizable in a game like Fusion. Fusion deliberately distances itself from Super by opting to focus almost exclusively on event progression over item progression. Again, more like Metroid 2. Instead of being tasked with something like killing all of the Metroids in a level, you're instead explicitly given a story reason to accomplish some specific task. The dialogue with your commanding officer, nicknamed Adam, and the story inform your gameplay nearly every step of the way. For example, you don't go out looking for bombs because they will benefit your navigation. Instead, you are tasked with acquiring bombs so that you might have a way out if the SAX traps you. The story is always informing your gameplay objectives. Yes, you're still exploring around for new power-ups, but it's within each sector and it's primarily for story purposes rather than for explorative application. That isn't to say that there is no exploration or item logic, however, because these elements have merely been de-emphasized. Acquiring the bombs in Fusion does expand your explorative area, but only within the specific sector that your mission takes place in. Macro-scale navigation is massively lessened in Fusion. Players are required to use bombs to finish their mission in their current sector rather than make any connection about locations outside of their immediate vicinity, at least for required progression. When I say required progression, I am referring to only what is strictly required of the player. Metroid Fusion still offers plenty of lateral-scale item contingent progression in the form of many optional expansion pickups. One such example of this would be collecting the gravity suit in Sector 5, and then backtracking to Sector 1 to use your new ability to collect this previously inaccessible missile tank. Macro-scale item progression is still here, but it has become optional. Optional is not at all the same thing as non-existent, but I do want to recognize that this may not scratch the exact kind of itch some players may be looking for. Item contingent expansion acquisition is just as prevalent, if not more so, than it was in Super. The new focus is on contextual or event progression, which takes various forms in the game world. Examples include these different security locked doors, or something like lowering the electric water in Sector 4. I think this kind of progression is really interesting because it asks you to assess something about the game world in in-universe terms. You're required to assess the situation laterally. Lowering water or unlocking a security level here opens other areas elsewhere throughout the world or level. What's unique about these specific instances in Fusion is that the logic does not operate on items, but instead you're making sense of something in the environment itself. like defeating the plant boss to destroy the vegetation blocking your progress. It's a unique flavor of the familiar progression, a fresh twist on the Metroid formula. I can't use level 0 hatches because the power is down, so I must find the computer terminal to restore auxiliary power. Doing this makes the world feel more real in a gameplay sense because you're actually interacting with the systems of the game world in a way that feels believable in-universe. It's really neat. Following Metroid NES and Metroid 2, Super Metroid placed great focus on its item progression and has become recognized as the grandfather of an entire genre. But it's worth noting that Fusion's event progression is not foreign to Metroid. The event progression of Fusion is very comparable to what was found in Metroid 2. Though there are certainly numerous differences. Acquiring power-ups does not expand your explorative area beyond your current sector as far as your main progression is concerned, because power-ups are no longer the focus of your progression. A mission will be assigned to you upon first entering a sector, and you will not be able to fully complete that task without also collecting some specific item. Additionally, your mission will sometimes result in acquiring an item by happenstance. The item must then be used to explore the sector to find new paths to complete your task or to return to the navigation room. For example, level 3 security locks must be released in order to grant access to the ice missile upgrade. So players are tasked with exploring Sector 5 to first find the security room, then proceed to locate the ice missile upgrade. Then, search to find the place to use their new ice missile to find their way back to the navigation room. Exploration is still absolutely a massive part of Metroid Fusion, but it's a more moment-to-moment style of exploration, more than something like Super's moments of across-the-world style of navigation and progression. I say moments because the dirty secret of even a game like Super Metroid is that much of its progression is far more linear and immediate than most seem to realize. There are plenty of big differences between these games, obviously, but I think it's worth discussing the many ways that these games are actually more similar than some players might realize. Entire massive chunks of Super Metroid share similarities with the design philosophy of Metroid Fusion, with things like restrictions on your navigation in the form of things like one-way gates and drops, or the self-contained progression of areas like Wrecked Ship, Meridia, Lower Norfair, and Turian. These 4 levels are started and finished on your first visit, placing expectations on your navigation away from lateral scale progression and navigation. Your first visit to Crateria, Brinstar, and Norfair are all also similar to Fusion in a lot of ways, for similarly only tasking you with progression in your immediate circumstances most of the time. Of course, the big difference is that Metroid Fusion doesn't open up until close to the end of the game, in addition to the moments between missions in which your navigation is mostly unrestricted. Super opens up much more overall. Of course, there are plenty of ways that Super's progression is completely unlike Fusion. The obvious difference is the removal of sequence breaking. Super Metroid opens much more overall because of its sequence breaking opportunities, whereas Fusion only lets you sequence break a single time as an Easter egg. Fusion's restrictions on your navigation are far more absolute. None can be bypassed with sequence breaking. Super Metroid goes out of its way to disguise its linearity, but Fusion's guidance is entirely unconcealed. Fusion even takes it a step further and characterizes its guidance in-universe as the actions of an NPC. This plays a massive role in the story, which we will cover later. Comparisons to Super aside, Metroid Fusion's progression isn't as simple as finding your way to an objective marker. Whenever Adam gives you an objective, simply going to that spot on the map is never as simple as walking straight to it. The game will place some kind of twist on the situation, such as security locks that you must locate and unlock first. Turning off electric water, not actually giving you an objective marker and telling you to search a sector, or any of the many forms of contextual progression like the previously mentioned power shutdown and vegetational growths. Fusion goes even further with challenging your navigation and progression, with making getting back out after completing the objective a challenge as well, such as with the SAX blocking off your escape after obtaining bombs, or being stuck in Sector 6 after obtaining the wave beam. It's not as open-ended as traditional Metroidvania, but Fusion still offers plenty of great explorative challenges in its own way. Each sector is a maze and a puzzle that you must overcome, not a straight hallway shooter with the player on a leash as some describe. There is a great opportunity for experimentation and exploration, it's just done within each sector for required progression. Expansions still offer a great amount of lateral scale item logic, and they can be lots of fun to hunt down between missions. This is certainly different, but different is not at all the same thing as bad. Fusion manages to offer its own flavor of exploration that makes it interesting in its own right. In addition to giving you objectives, Adam will also sometimes tell you about something in the mission to be on the lookout for. Adam's guidance is explicit in the case of the Ice X. He does directly tell you to avoid them, but Adam doesn't go around doing things with or for you. Adam's objectives are never as simple as going straight to the map marker. When he talks about the nightmare, for example, he says absolutely nothing about how to kill it. He simply provides a little bit of information about it and says it needs to be killed. At most, this could be described as vague guidance. Deciding to make Adam an AI restricted to navigation rooms works well for this dynamic of being helpful without crowding the game world with other NPCs. Progression is decided by Adam, but much of the journey is still in the hands of the player. Backtracking in Fusion is punctuated by the narrative and scripted progression of Fusion. The sectors of Fusion are not a one-and-done kind of deal like the areas of Metroid 2, as you'll need to visit each sector at least twice. Adam determines when you'll visit which sector, and what your task in that sector will be. You might be able to visit a different sector a little earlier than Adam says, but some item gate will quickly prevent you from being able to proceed any further. Coming back later isn't going to be your choice, it's going to be Adam's. Non-linear sectors are visited in a linear order, and this order is determined by Adam, not the player. The progression and navigational structures between Return of Samus and Fusion are similar in that you are still doing non-linear areas in a linear order, but the big difference is, of course, Adam. Adam tells you when you'll be going where, and will lock doors to prevent you from going elsewhere. Despite this, I still don't think Fusion's navigation is that much more restrictive than Metroid 2. Metroid 2 may allow you to backtrack anytime you like, but the game has outlined expectations about your progression in such a way that a player doesn't need to concern themselves with other levels. Your cognitive load is reset every time you enter a new level, and you never search earlier levels to find Metroids. Metroid Fusion actively prevents you from leaving a sector until your objective is complete, but in practice, these two versions of restricting your navigation are similar. Metroid 2 might not literally prevent you from backtracking, but the player is well aware of the fact that they will not progress by returning to older levels either way. As far as progression is concerned, Metroid 2 may as well lock you into each new level you enter. Metroid 2's game design is placing expectations on restricting your navigation, and Metroid Fusion is having an NPC enforce restrictions on your navigation. Fusion is often accused of flying in the face of the entire structure of Metroid, but really there's plenty of stuff here that feels quite similar to Return of Samus in my opinion. I mentioned in my Super Metroid video that backtracking to older areas doesn't really change the world very often on Zebes. Pirates and creatures do appear in Old Turian, the music does change in Crateria, and the power turns on in the wrecked ship, but there's not too much of this in Super. Fusion, conversely, does this kind of thing constantly. As early as your first visit to Sector 2, coming back into this room after collecting bombs will use the environment to show you that the SAX is actively trying to trap you. Even these Zeros will start off crawling all over every surface, enter their cocoons, later to act as platforms, and even later they'll emerge as key hunters. This tells a story about the life cycle of these creatures, but it also raises the difficulty during your revisit to Sector 2 later in the game. The game didn't just randomly decide to drop in tough enemies to raise tension, they built it up from the beginning to realize it as a believable story of the environment itself. Other moments include the boiler meltdown of Sector 3, the destruction of Sector 5, the changing behavior of the Ice X in Sector 6, the plant growths of Sector 2, the surprise power down of the BSL, the Metroid husks appearing in Sector 1, the destruction of the hangar bay at the end of the game. The list just goes on and on. There are so many big and little moments of the environment changing in Fusion. Moments like these serve the narrative excellently and offer very unique and interesting gameplay scenarios. Your exploration in the now destroyed Sector 5 feels completely fresh because of the changes to the layout of the sector, and the boiler explosion turns a revisit into an exhilarating story and action set piece. You're now racing against the clock to stop the entire station from self-destructing. There is so much variety in the areas, partially because they are always changing and interesting things are always happening. Fusion is taking advantage of opportunities afforded by its more linear structure at every turn. Fusion is de-emphasizing open exploration in favor of more scripted story segments, whether those segments are communicated through dialogue or through the environments and gameplay itself. As a little aside, I'd like to briefly discuss the matter of replayability in Metroid Fusion. Replaying these scripted segments may not feel as exciting on repeat playthroughs, but I think the benefits far outweigh the drawbacks. Just because you know the twist is coming, I don't think that therefore means that these kinds of things suddenly have no value to us, even on repeat. Even if I am no longer shocked by Nightmare's devastating destruction of Sector 5, I am always thrilled by it. These kinds of things don't need to actively surprise you in order to stay interesting. Exploration conceptually similarly diminishes enjoyment on repeat playthroughs. So this potential issue of replaying something lessening its impact certainly isn't unique to Metroid Fusion, nor is it unique to a game's story. Once you've become familiar with a Metroid game's world, you are, by definition, no longer exploring it. So what am I saying? I'm not trying to imply that exploration is shitty and that Fusion's focus on narrative is the better option. No, I'm just saying that this issue of replayability is certainly not exclusive to this kind of narrative. So Fusion's new priorities do not necessarily diminish replay value on their own. Super certainly has the advantage when it comes to replayability because of things like its sequence breaking, but I think it's important to recognize that these story moments in this game do have a place in Metroid, and they cannot be uniquely criticized for lacking replayability in comparison to Super's exploration. I think what really hurts the replayability of this game is the fact that the navigation room dialogue scenes are unskippable. Having to sit through this dialogue every single time seriously hurts replayability, and it's easily my greatest complaint with this game. But with that tangent set aside, I'd like to talk some more about the navigation. Metroid Fusion blocks off older areas to you not with one-way gates, rising lava, or giant pitfalls, but rather this game uses these locked doors. Every time you enter a sector to begin a mission, Adam will restrict you to that sector. As I said before, this is at least similar to how Metroid 2 is structured. But why go so far as to physically prevent backtracking when the game already makes it clear that you need to be here? These navigational restrictions on the player do not feel as natural as something like Super's one-way sand pits, but that's kind of the whole point. Your world design, progression, and navigation are all meant to feel artificial and deliberate. This might sound like a bad thing, but I say that it's merely different. It offers its own pros and cons that end up making Fusion feel unique in its own right. That door locking behind you didn't do that for no reason, because it turns out that your AI commanding officer has full access to level 0 hatches. The restrictions aren't random, and they do not break immersion because they are contextualized in the universe as a character physically locking the doors behind you. So why would Adam do that to you? Well, it's initially unclear, but it turns out that the Federation does have something to hide from you. This is just one of many ways that the game uses gameplay to arouse suspicion in the narrative. To sum up Fusion's navigation, yes, it is certainly different from games like Super, and yes, it certainly has some potentially negative effects on the traditional Metroidvania experience. I think it's very clear by now that Metroid Fusion is not trying to be just another traditional Metroidvania game, and that these deviations are all deliberately designed to service a different kind of gameplay and narrative experience. Players are welcome to have their own preferences about this shift in priorities, but I believe that Metroid as a series has always prided itself on offering a variety of gameplay experiences. Fusion doesn't follow the Metroidvania rulebook, and while I obviously love traditional Metroidvania, I don't see Fusion's deviations as this blasphemous insult to the franchise that its greatest detractors describe. Fusion's changes to the design principles surrounding its progression and navigation are every bit as valid as quote-unquote true Metroid as any other game in the series in my mind, and I've never heard a convincing argument to convince me otherwise. The level design in Metroid Fusion adopts many design principles from Super Metroid, with goals to make each room layout interesting and unique. Much of what I've said about Super Metroid's level design can also be said of Metroid Fusion. If it isn't broken, don't fix it. I don't feel the need to repeat myself in such excruciating detail, but I will say that Metroid Fusion's level design still has plenty of familiar tricks like wordlessly teaching the applications of new abilities through the level design, as well as new backtracking opportunities offered to keep the navigation fresh. fresh. The level design of the area that you get the speed booster in demonstrates both of these design tricks very well. Metroid Fusion will lock you into a small area until you figure out that you must destroy these enemies to clear a runway, and then draining the water will open a new path to allow you to return to the navigation room in a fresh new route instead of just backtracking for backtracking's sake. Though Metroid Fusion does adopt design principles of Super Metroid, that isn't to say that Metroid Fusion doesn't offer anything new to the table. For one, the previously mentioned ladders and ledge grabbing moves are constantly implemented into the level design to utilize these moves as interesting variation within your platforming and traversal. Enemy encounters are recontextualized with your new moves and require you to assess situations according to the circumstances of the level design, such as with this giant ladder climb in Sector 3. You gotta approach this room and these enemies differently because you're on this ladder. It's not mind-blowing stuff, but it certainly helps keep the moment-to-moment gameplay more interesting. Another way that Metroid Fusion spices things up is with even more frequent and more challenging secret tiles hidden within many rooms. Since Fusion is often restricting your navigation, the game knows that you cannot falsely conclude you've hit a dead end. The game is certain that the player is in the right area, so Metroid Fusion's unique design structure can allow the game to get away with more secretive hidden tiles. This isn't the issue that it would be in other Metroid games because the player can't go off wasting time in other levels. The game's linearity also allows these secrets to start off fairly easy, such as with the destructible floor hint outside of Zazaby's boss room. Compare that to something like this segment in Lower Sector 4, and there's a clear difficulty curve. I get a tremendous amount of enjoyment from secret searching in Metroid games, and Fusion offers the best secrets yet, and has some of the best secrets in the entire series. Fusion's secrets are challenging and varied, and they often test your critical thinking skills. Super Metroid had this as well, but Metroid Fusion offers even more going on with how it tests you to discover secrets. Usual subtleties in the environments return, such as this gap in these rocks in Sector 6 hinting at a destructible tile. But there are also memorable secrets, like screw attacking these blocks to create a runway to Shinespark into a false wall, picking up on level design oddities to realize you have to Shinespark into this ceiling in Sector 5, or noticing this strange block placement to use Speed Booster to reach a level 2 security lock. Purposefully not collecting X parasites to allow them to transform into a new creature you need for some puzzle, such as with escaping Sector 5, or any of the nutty shine-sparking challenges for expansions. Fusion takes its secrets to a whole new level, with testing you in unique and interesting ways. It's unfortunate that the X-ray scope and scan pulse are not here to offer an optional help tool to those who value that sort of thing, especially since the select button doesn't do anything. But the game still has other ways of assuring that the player's time is not wasted, such as intuitive secret hinting telegraphs, navigational restrictions, power bombs, and objectives. The room layouts in Fusion aren't laid out exactly as you'd expect a spaceship meant for humans would be, but the 2D perspective does a lot of heavy lifting for blurring the lines of what you're playing and the actual physical layout of the BSL you might imagine. 2D games kind of get away with this because we are not meant to take what we see as literal. So despite its odd layout, I don't think that Metroid Fusion's choice of setting harms the level design, or makes it feel more gamey. If anything, the choice of setting enhances the experience by offering unique set pieces, world layouts, and mechanics. Even so, the level layouts keep things more believable. The more claustrophobic and twisty areas are ventilation shafts. The more wide open areas are water tanks. The wider horizontal stretches are lava pools and sand dunes. There is all kinds of individualization to each area. Level design is the best that the series has seen to this point, and I think this is just one of many things that contributes towards Fusion having some of the best moment-to-moment gameplay in the series. Before getting into the story segment, I feel the need to give credit where it's due. There is an excellent video going over some of Metroid Fusion's story by this YouTube channel called Transparency. I don't usually like to talk about other videos like this, but this video is so great that I have to recommend it to every Metroid fan. They do a far better job covering this topic than I ever could. Much of what I go over here is inspired by ideas shared in that video, though my thoughts are certainly my own. It's a great watch. I'll link their video in the description. But anyways, in a lot of ways, Fusion is more of a sequel to Metroid 2 than it is to Super. Everything from the narrative to the world design are much more reminiscent of Return of Samus, but this is also true of the game's story. The Galactic Federation has stood as the unequivocally good and just faction of the universe, simply on the merit of opposing the space pirates and therefore being a force of good. The black and white nature of the first game's story was questioned in Metroid 2, as I went over in that video, but Metroid Fusion is the logical next step. In the opening, the Federation is still as they have always been, hiring Samus for her usefulness as a protector of the Federation. Everything changes once Samus encounters an unfamiliar foe, and it becomes infected with a deadly parasite. This unfamiliar foe is known as the X. It turns out that eliminating all of the Metroids allowed an even more powerful threat to rise and threaten all life in the universe. The defining trait of the X parasite is that they are capable of consuming and replicating any organism on a cellular structure. Merely making contact with one will allow the X to assimilate its victim, even obtaining the knowledge of the host creature. X operate on instinct, wanting only to spread as much as they can to consume everything. Their unique ability places them in their own ballpark of potential for devastation, and they have now infected the player character. The Federation operates on Samus to attempt to save her life, surgically removing large components of her power suit. Their efforts to save Samus seem futile until someone suggests giving her a Metroid vaccine. It turns out that the Metroids were the predator of the X, almost like they were specifically designed to eliminate X. The vaccine is extremely effective, but it permanently changes Samus's DNA. She can never be infected by an X again. Before long, Samus is tasked with investigating the Biologic Space Labs, a Federation research facility. There was a mysterious explosion at the Quarantine Bay, the location that stores Samus's surgically removed suit components. Very little is understood about the X this early on in the story, but Samus is sent in to investigate. It turns out that there has been an outbreak of X on the BSL, and it's up to Samus to put a stop to the spreading X parasite. For this mission, the Federation is making Samus follow the orders of a computerized commanding officer. Samus says that this computer reminds her of her old commanding officer, Adam Malkovich, from her days in the Federation. Out of respect and some irony, she nicknames the computer after Adam. The main structure for most of the game is that Adam will task you with completing a mission within a single sector. Usually, you're tasked with obtaining a new power-up to increase your chances of survival. Or maybe you need to defeat a certain monster to slow the spread of the X, such as with Ceres. It's built through the whole story that the X are growing as a bigger threat and spreading throughout the station. They're trying to hinder and sabotage you at every turn. The fact that they're willing to self-destruct the station and die on the BSL later in the story just to kill Samus shows that they understand that Samus is the only living thing to pose a threat against them. This strategic thinking on the X's part is a huge part of the story and makes them that much more threatening. It's perfectly logical that the X would do this, and these moments being in the story make the game that much better. From the very beginning, you are given a companion character in the form of Samus's new gunship's artificial intelligence. As part of her agreement of accepting this mission and being given this new ship, Samus must take orders from an AI Federation commanding officer. From the very start, the Federation is suspicious by asking Samus, of all people, for a seemingly simple and easy mission. They can't even trust her to handle this suspiciously simple mission on her own, forcing her to take orders like this. We could go even further back and see that Samus's trust in the Federation was questioned at the end of Metroid 2, as I went over in that video. So this story element isn't really new as much as it is a continuation of what was built in Metroid 2. Rather than making the Federation feel one note, the Federation are given characterization to be a large and complicated faction capable of good and bad. The larger Metroid narrative was already one note with its space pirates and Federation, and games like Metroid 2 and Metroid Fusion are disrupting that dynamic to give our characters a more personal challenge, one that can't be solved just by blowing up another monster. Samus may not like taking orders, working directly under a commanding officer like this, but Fusion puts in the legwork to make this situation feel believable and logical. The Federation's initial goal is to power Samus up as much as they can, and to search for survivors and save human lives. Their mutual goals make this dynamic mutually beneficial for both parties. So even though Samus may not like taking orders, there's plenty here to justify this exception. There is also, of course, the nice new ship and saving Samus's life with a Metroid vaccine, but Adam also offers a unique wealth of information about the X, the BSL, and the greater situation in general. This makes him very valuable to Samus. At the same time, however, I don't think that Adam's guidance goes so far as to harm Discovery. By having Adam build things like the bosses up before encountering them, it creates anticipation. The game also builds anticipation and tension with bosses like Nettery and the Nightmare, both through dialogue and through the environment. Before you even see the boss, you're shown things like the incredible and rapid growth of vegetation all over Sector 2, this giant skeleton in this water tank, Nightmare's shadow, and Sector 5 getting absolutely wrecked. or this mysterious frozen Ridley corpse. These visual story elements raise the tension for the encounters by showing you tangible changes in the world being made by these mysterious encounters. I'd even go so far as to say that Metroid Fusion builds up its boss encounters better than any other game in the series. The dialogue doesn't actually tell you exactly how to defeat the boss, or even very much about the bosses at all. They are kept pretty vague, and mentioning them and foreshadowing them makes them some of the most memorable fights in the series. Adam might tell you some little tidbits, like that Nightmare can manipulate gravity, or that Saris can move at ultra high speed, but this still keeps things pretty vague. I could describe the objective markers of this game in a similar way. They might give you a rough idea of what you're getting into, but the player is left with plenty to figure out on their own. Adam will usually give you an objective marker, but as I discussed previously, completing your mission is never as simple as walking straight there and back. This commanding officer and Fusion's structure overall undeniably take away much of what people have come to appreciate about Metroid, but I think that this criticism can sometimes be exaggerated, taken so far as to say things like item progression or exploration are outright removed. I think it's important to make the distinction that while these things certainly are intentionally downplayed, they are far from absent in Metroid Fusion. Some people have taken issue with Samus's line in the prologue about being reborn as something different, because Samus doesn't actually look different underneath her suit. I think this line could describe Samus's literal new suit, yeah, but it also takes figurative meaning in the form of Samus's growth as a character. Samus has come to a revelation with her newfound understanding of her own place in this ongoing narrative. Samus is not a terribly complicated character. She lives in a universe with cartoonishly evil space pirates, and the Federation wants to pay her to stop them. Samus has followed orders to a T until the end of Metroid 2. Wherein she finally begins to question her mission and define her own agency as separate from that of the Federation. The logical next step from there is to affirm her independence for the greater good. And Fusion's story is all about realizing this goal. At the very beginning here, she is reborn in the sense that she has a newfound perspective on her killings during the last 3 games, especially the eradication of the Metroids on SR388. She has seen firsthand that her own past has come to haunt her, with a new foe rising in the form of the X-Parasite. She underwent this entire X-infection and all this surgery, this near-death experience, all because she created this problem by killing off all of the Metroids. Exactly how dangerous the X are is initially unclear, but Samus herself is to blame for whatever comes from the situation. At the same time, however, Samus's defiance of the Federation has saved her own life and would go on to literally save the universe. The revelation here explores Samus as a character more deeply than traditional Metroid ever could, and we learn about Samus's growth in choosing her own path in her life for her own reasons. Samus has awakened to a newfound perspective in her trust in how she goes about doing the right thing. Her on-the-fly decision in Metroid 2 and her subsequent near-death experience with the X-Parasite have both completely changed how she views her world. What initially seemed like a remarkably black-and-white viewpoint of the factions of the Metroid universe has not only evolved for Samus, but also the player experiencing all of this alongside her. You read in the manual of Metroid 2 that these creatures were too dangerous to be kept alive, and you killed all of those monsters on Zebus and SR388. But now, things have irreversibly changed, and Samus's perspective has been reborn. As Metroid Fusion continues, this newfound perspective is tested and pushed to its breaking point by the climax of the story. I think this line in the opening reflects the themes of the larger narrative remarkably well, and this is actually one of my favorite moments in the whole series for that reason. Metroid Fusion has a lot to say about Samus as a character through the X-Parasites, and nowhere is this more apparent than with the SAX. The SAX is the result of Samus's X-infection during her second mission on SR388. X-infected components of her power suit were surgically removed and stored in the quarantine bay. Nobody fully understood what the X were capable of, and the SAX initiated the X outbreak on the BSL by assimilating Samus's abilities to break out of the quarantine bay with a power bomb. Evil doppelgangers of the main character are a common trope in many fantasy stories. SAX is one of many that exists within the realm of video games, but the SAX is easily my personal favorite of this trope. Fusion uses the SAX to have something to say about Samus herself as a character. Another Samus with whited eyes is blowing holes in walls. It's explained that this is an X copying you, but not much else is known. How powerful is this thing exactly? What does it want? The SA-X is only Samus, but heartless, as Samus puts it. An unremorseful killing machine that shows no mercy. The SA-X is a literal and figurative reflection of Samus's character from the first 3 games, showing that Samus was no different from the SA-X in how she hunted her prey. It goes even further in that Samus is responsible for the creation of the SA-X, making this Samus's own failure. The SA-X sets itself apart from the other villains of the series by being the direct result of Samus's actions. She brought these consequences on herself, and she is forced to experience the tables turning completely. Samus is now on the receiving end of her own misdeeds on SR388. You are now the Metroid that is being hunted by Samus. The SA-X represents everything you used to be, free and powerful, but also a killing machine. It even kills you the same way you killed Metroids in the previous games. The SA-X is a twisted perversion of Samus, and yet it's difficult to tell its actions apart from yours in the previous games. Metroid Fusion is ballsy not just for its approach to the game design, but also its willingness to criticize Samus's misdeeds in the ongoing narrative of the series. Metroid Fusion is a game with something to say about the larger series, and I think that's part of what makes it my favorite Metroid story. In terms of story, I think the SA-X is nothing short of absolutely brilliant. What also makes the SA-X scary is not what you see most of the time, but what you don't see. The SA-X is a great example of how rarely seeing the monster can make the fear factor more effective. It's similar to how you barely see the shark in the movie Jaws, or how rarely you actually see the alien in that movie. Because the SA-X is rarely used, it makes those fewer moments much more meaningful. Less is more sometimes, as I keep saying. The SA-X encounters do lose their luster on repeat playthroughs because the SA-X shows up in the same places every time. But since all horror loses its effectiveness when repeated anyways, I think it's totally fine for Fusion to go in the direction that it does. Changing up the encounter locations may have offered some potentially more interesting gameplay, but gameplay was never really the point of the SA-X. So with the premise laid out, I'd like to rewind a bit to discuss how Fusion uses its structure to build to its best moment, the climax of the story. The Galactic Federation is initially very helpful to Samus. They give her a nice new gunship and save her life with the Metroid vaccine. But something feels off, even from the beginning. Why are they tasking Samus with investigating a quarantine bay explosion on home territory? Why are they issuing an AI commanding officer to oversee your mission here? This seemingly simple affair is shrouded in unusual circumstances, and even Samus says that this awakens a nameless fear in her heart. Virtually nothing is known about this mysterious parasite that is being stored in the BSL's quarantine bay, and yet the Federation is calling in Samus herself to deal with the situation. Of course, Samus is uniquely capable since her Metroid DNA grants her immunity to the X, but why give her this commanding officer? One thing that's easy to miss is that in order to save Samus's life, the Federation used Metroid DNA to develop a vaccine. How could they have gotten their hands on Metroid DNA? There's a great air of mystery and intrigue right from the start, and things continue to escalate as the game continues. Additional story moments further complicate the situation and raise more and more suspicion. The BSL itself is meant to house a variety of fauna from Zebes and SR388, but what is the greater purpose of funding all of this research? One thing early on that is easily missed is this cold room where you can push through to see something you're not supposed to. Ridley's corpse is recovered and stored here. How did the Federation manage to retrieve Ridley's remains? What purpose could a biological space laboratory have for studying Ridley, or Zebes, or SR388? There is so much intrigue in Fusion, and it only keeps going. The tension rises even higher once the X attempt to destroy themselves and the station just to kill Samus. Adam shows an interest in understanding the full extent of what the X are truly capable of, understanding their capacity for a greater level of awareness. Just a bit later, the death of all BSL crew members is confirmed. You'd think that this would mean that it's time to withdraw and detonate the station, right? Well, Adam sends you back down to Sector 5 to obtain power bombs, and upon returning to your ship, the power of the entire station is suddenly cut. Adam now tasks you with restoring power to the ship, and it's unclear exactly why this would be important. Why would maintaining the ship be of any concern from this point onwards? Nonetheless, after restoring the power, Adam is surprised that you managed to restore Plasma Beam on your own and discourages you from facing the SAX. Adam previously mentioned that the Federation was working on preparing a plasma beam for you, but it was never sent and you never heard about it again. You may not have noticed, but your objectives have shifted completely from becoming more powerful and eliminating the X to instead protecting and maintaining the BSL while the X tried to destroy it. They haven't been sending you anything since you got your power bombs, as though powering you up is suddenly no longer a concern. This lack of support from the Federation raises suspicions, but it also serves to restore agency back to Samus. You're restoring power-ups on your own now, and this further lessens the importance of Samus relying on the Federation for progress. This wedge in your relationship grows as the game continues, and then you learn about their project they call the Nightmare. The Federation is using their research here to make tremendously dangerous bioweapons like this, and Adam knew about this thing the whole time. It's only being brought up now because it's destroying the entire station, so it has to be addressed. Why is the Federation being so picky about where you can and can't go? Why has the Federation suddenly stopped sending you upgrades once the X showed a greater potential and all crew members were confirmed dead? Why are they developing these horrendous bioweapons like the Nightmare? What's the deal with this conversation with this suit asking Adam if Samus suspects anything? This scene doesn't sit well with me because it makes the suspicious activity of the Federation way too obvious. Fusion does all of this outstanding work to slowly ease the player subtly towards being more and more suspicious of the Federation, and it feels like this one scene kind of flies in the face of that. It's way too on the nose, and while it doesn't ruin all of the great writing that Fusion does elsewhere, it is a blemish on an otherwise masterful build-up towards this excellent twist. Though I will admit that other players have said that it was this line that got them to reconsider their perspective on the story up to that point. It seems obvious to me, but others have said that they needed this line in order to help them take notice of the subtleties elsewhere. So your mileage on this one will vary. But aside from this one part, I think this twist is built masterfully. Fusion might initially feel like isolation is not a priority of this game since you're constantly following the orders of a commanding officer, but the payoff of this structure becomes clear once you play the game further. This trust that Samus and the player has towards the computerized commanding officer is slowly wedged further and further until eventually you feel completely alone. Fusion isn't just inspired by John Carpenter's The Thing, but also the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. Both Space Odyssey and Fusion use similar techniques to enhance the feeling of terror in gradually becoming distrusting towards HAL 9000 and Adam respectively, though both are also interesting in their own ways. The X are very unsettling, but there is something especially sinister about slowly realizing that your companion character is just as much of an enemy as the X. Building up Adam as a helpful character, but also using his guidance as a weapon, helps build this feeling of distrust once things start to become more and more suspicious. You begin to regain power-ups on your own, making Adam feel less useful and more obstructive than anything. Samus's agency is slowly taken back, even with her opening level 4 security hatches without authorization. This all comes to a head once Samus finds a restricted zone, an area that she enters despite Adam ordering Samus to return to the navigation room immediately. Once the reveal finally comes, it comes in the form of an interactive gameplay experience. This kind of interactivity was something I praised in Super Metroid for making the player an active participant in the investigative process. This interactive story scene stuff is just as great, if not better, here in Fusion. Because the story is so much more involved and the game has spent so much more time and effort building up to this, the payoff here is huge for allowing the player to stumble into the restricted zone and see for themselves what's really going on. I'm so glad that this discovery is not some kind of cutscene, because experiencing it firsthand increases the efficacy of this reveal tenfold. This is why Fusion's story is such a satisfying payoff for everything building up to this moment. This reveal wouldn't have half the impact if it was just traditional Metroidvania up to this point. All of the restrictions and linearity have allowed for all of these meticulously crafted interactive story moments, and the linearity has also served to characterize the Federation through gameplay. That's why I can't agree with the sentiment that this Federation is evil for no good reason. The game does so much with making this dynamic interesting that it's amounted to the very best Metroid story. Gameplay is synergized with the story in such a compelling way, and your entire 3 previous adventures recontextualize not only the actions of the Federation, but also the actions of Samus. Metroid is usually about exploring different alien worlds with disguised linearity, but Fusion's artificial environments and its greater and overt linearity pay off here with outstanding storytelling, turning things inward to look at the human side of the universe, but with a twist of this new and even greater threat that is the X-Parasite. Metroid Fusion's commitment to a more restrictive and linear design has been in service of this unique flavor of ludonarrative synchronicity. Not long after, Adam is ordered to restrict Samus to a navigation room while the Federation army is deployed to collect an X-Parasite. The Federation wants the SA-X in particular, replicating its mass production of incredible technology via asexual division. Instead of some giant monster that Samus can blow up just like any other Metroid game, we have a secretive group within the Federation posing a threat by providing the X an opportunity to spread across the galaxy. The limitless potential of the X is seen as an opportunity rather than something to be feared by this group that has already risked everything for something exactly like this. The X can easily mass produce the most powerful technology in the universe just by reproducing asexually. An opportunity to research the X and utilize their unique ability is of course going to be appealing to these guys. This problem can't be solved by just blowing up some big monster. Samus has to reason with Adam to save the day. I like the idea that Samus has to do something other than shoot a monster to win. This Adam AI is a proper character, separate from the real Adam, and it is forced to make a decision about the right thing to do. So, after Samus attempts to reason with the computer, the AI decides to betray the Rogue Federation operatives to do the right thing. Adam suggests altering the BSL's collision course to crash the station into SR-388, and use the self-destruct bomb on the station to vaporize both the BSL and the planet. The computer has decided to help Samus and has taken on the characteristics of Adam because it is later explained that a copy of the real Adam's consciousness exists within the AI. Even with this AI being based on Adam, this does not bring the real Adam back. No AI could ever replace a real human being that you've lost. Adam was willing to sacrifice himself to save Samus, so it's completely logical that AI Adam would be willing to sacrifice himself to save Samus and the universe. I like the idea that Samus herself and Adam's programmed characteristics come together by appealing to this AI to do what's right. This fleshes out the AI as a proper character, and character growth is the path to victory here. Samus has grown as a character through Fusion's recontextualization of the entire series. Blindly killing for the Federation, shooting first and asking questions later, this was Samus's character flaw. It was her defiance of the Federation that unknowingly saved the universe in Metroid 2, and it is her defiance of the Federation that saved the day here, partnered with her figurative reunion with Adam. It might feel hypocritical to some for Samus to destroy an entire planet at the end of the game, but I think this misses the point of the actual message that Fusion is going for. Samus has never had a problem with killing, but she must make these decisions herself. She must claim her own agency and make these choices for the right reasons. There is a huge difference between preemptively eradicating the Metroids just in case anyone ever finds them, and killing the X because they are certain to consume the entire universe. The final boss is somewhat of a copy of Super's final boss, but with an Omega Metroid. I think the idea is supposed to be that Samus is so low on health from the encounter with the SA-X that she's too weak to fight the Omega. So the SA-X comes in to face the greater threat of the two of them. This moment where the SA-X offers itself to Samus shows some kind of greater capacity for thought than what Samus and the player may have initially suspected out of the X. Earlier in the game, Samus refers to the X as heartless, but this moment shows that perhaps the X are capable of some form of sympathy. Some say that the SA-X just wanted to guarantee the death of the Omega Metroid, but I don't think that this is the case. The SA-X knows that all life here is guaranteed to die in the explosion, so the Omega is dead either way in a matter of minutes. It seems to me that the SA-X made a choice to help Samus, which obviously goes against everything we suspected about them. Some might consider this some kind of plot hole, but I think it's a great ending. It's not accidentally contradictory, it's deliberately making you question what you know about the X. Samus thought that the Metroids and her ship computer were heartless too, and it turns out she might be wrong. It's possible that the X are also capable of some form of sympathy and compassion. As neat as this story moment is, I do think it suffers from being a bit too similar to the Mother Brain fight in Super. That's hardly a big deal to me, but they are borrowing an older story element to say something new about the X. Fusion's story is an excellent blend of in-universe dialogue and interactive story scenes similar to the ones found in Super Metroid. The story is constantly throwing surprises at you from start to finish, offering something completely unique to this game. It doesn't merely justify its greater focus on linear progression, but absolutely blows me away with how well it masters fully taking advantage of this increased linearity. Metroid Fusion deliberately places itself away from non-linear progression to synergize its design philosophies into something completely unforgettable. Samus has saved the galaxy countless times, and many people barely even believe she exists or care to show her the respect she deserves. Despite her defining moment being her act of mercy in Metroid 2, her legacy in the galaxy is that she's the greatest killer in the known universe. She's known by some in the Federation for her achievements in defeating space pirates, but ultimately her contributions are hardly recognized or known. By the end of Fusion, she's seen as a potential criminal, held under investigation. It's kind of fucked up that again and again she's lost so many people, like her parents, her gay bird dads, Adam, the larva Metroid, and she doesn't even let any of that slow her down. Reclaiming her agency and saving the universe yet again is what Samus is all about, and I can't help but feel like this game really does something special with humanizing Samus. Her life is a continuous cycle of loss, and her resolve remains unwavering even in the craziest circumstances. I know the lore of the Metroid series is messy and weird, but the underlying through line of Samus's tragic heroism and unwavering determination in the face of unfathomable horrors really makes Metroid special to me in a way that makes every story feel so engaging. I know this isn't some kind of big-brained high art or whatever, but I like Metroid games a lot. I'd like to take some time to examine some specific criticisms levied towards Fusion's story, and offer my thoughts on them. Some might be common criticisms that you've heard before, others might be obscure and somewhat obviously fallacious from the outset. Regardless, I think discussing these provides an interesting opportunity to appreciate smaller things about Fusion's writing. I don't care to go through most criticisms, so I'll just handpick a few that might generate some interesting discussion. One criticism of this game is that Samus is melodramatic or overly emotional. I think that Samus is far from melodramatic in this game. I'm not sure exactly what inspires this criticism, but I imagine that it must be this scene with Samus being locked into this navigation room. Remember here that Samus is witnessing what will amount to the end of all known life in the universe, and she's actually able to compose herself very well and remain focused on saving lives. This is the opposite of overly emotional. She's showing her determination to do the right thing above all else. Samus doesn't even actually get mad until she learns that all known life in the universe will end for an entirely preventable and foolish reason. Samus usually comes in to save the day, but this time she is forced to just sit and watch as entire solar systems will be devoured. Samus has a damn good reason to be angry and to speak up at this point in the game. The X are about to wreak havoc on the entire universe, and a computer is forcing her to just sit and watch. Even someone as stoic as Samus would reasonably be upset here, and it's not even like she reacts in an overly emotional way. It almost feels like Samus showing any emotion at all, no matter the circumstances, isn't going to sit well with certain fans of the series. So yeah, I strongly disagree with this criticism. I think this scene is memorable for humanizing Samus and showing us that even she is capable of getting mad at frustrating things. I'm just as mad at the Federation as Samus is for their foolish ambitions, and I think this makes for interesting characterization and storytelling. I don't think it's melodramatic to be angry about the very preventable death of all known life in the universe. The next common criticism is that Metroid Fusion does not allow you to skip dialogue. I completely agree that this is bad, but I don't think we should be taking the criticism further and blaming this entire storytelling method. Metroid Fusion's dialogue deserves criticism for not allowing you to skip or fast forward it even on repeat playthroughs, but this storytelling method itself is not to blame. This is a matter of fumbled execution, not a bad idea. Metroid Fusion's dialogue has its own advantages over other storytelling methods like minimalism, cinematic cutscenes, or the scan visor. Delivering story information passively with scattered and missable puzzle pieces would miss the entire point of this narrative. Adam's helpfulness is doubled as Adam is also controlling you, and instead of feeling restricted by the game, you feel restricted by Adam, which makes the payoff at the end all the more satisfying. This dialogue is straightforward and streamlined. Instead of having to search an entire world for puzzle pieces to put together, you are given a holistic and streamlined story experience. The writers can build on established ideas because they know that you've witnessed those previous ideas. There is no potential for you to miss a scan and miss critical information about the plot. The gameplay of Fusion places you in the same headspace as Samus in a way simply not possible without this specific story and gameplay structure. You have this unique feeling of unease and growing distrust towards the Federation that raises isolation and tension as the game continues. All of Fusion's mysteries and twists work not in spite of this game's linearity and story structure, but specifically because of those things. It's synergized with the gameplay in such a way where removing this gameplay structure would lessen the ludonarrative synchronicity considerably. Environmental and epistolary storytelling simply cannot provide you with this kind of involved narrative. Fusion is taking full advantage of this kind of interactive narrative experience. Fusion's plot is evolving in complex ways in the here and now, simply not possible with epistolary storytelling, because epistolary storytelling, by its very nature, takes place in the past. Words written in the past by other characters cannot tell Metroid Fusion's kind of story. I'm not trying to say that any one of these storytelling methods is necessarily better or worse, merely different with unique merits. Moving on to the last criticism, Samus accidentally calls the computer Adam, which some have criticized for feeling contrived. Remember that Samus is frequently reminded of Adam because this AI contains a copy of the consciousness and characteristics of the real Adam. Samus also mentions that working under this Federation commanding officer reminds her of her time working under her other former Federation CO. Being on Federation territory, working directly under a Federation CO, and that officer is an AI clone of Adam, I think it's completely reasonable for her to be reminded of Adam. If you think that having Adam's consciousness being in the database of this particular AI is contrived, then I think it's worth considering that details surrounding the actual Adam are kept pretty vague. I think it's entirely reasonable that with Adam being a high-ranking member of their military, he would be chosen to have his, as Samus puts it, perfect military mind uploaded to their AI program. Adam is a valuable asset to the Federation, and AI programs are usually built with a wealth of knowledge from a large array of different databases to draw from. To call the real Adam's connection to this AI contrived might mean that you're drawing your own contextual conclusions about the source material. There is room for multiple interpretations here, and assuming the worst feels unfair to Metroid Fusion. The game makes specific mention of the fact that the minds of leaders and scientists are frequently uploaded to computers, and that Adam is a perfect military mind. Taking that into consideration, it really doesn't feel contrived to me at all. If there is any criticism that I do have, it is that we are only informed on this with hindsight. This information about Adam is provided in the game's epilogue, rather than being hinted at beforehand. It still works as it is, but it'd work a lot better if the game built up to this rather than having to go backwards to fill in the blanks. I'm more concerned about the ordering of the story bits rather than the actual story bits themselves. Combat in Fusion benefits from the increased linearity with a difficulty curve that keeps combat interesting. Since this game knows the order of the sectors you'll be visiting, tougher enemies and bosses are placed in later game areas. Older sectors often get new enemies, such as with the Zeros hatching into Key Hunters in Sector 2. If you've played 2D Metroid games before, then you know what to expect for combat encounters. I don't really feel the need to explain it a fourth time here. I'd prefer just to talk about what's new, such as the new flare damage mechanic. Flare damage is a new extra feature with a charge beam that makes it so firing a charge shot now does extra damage to anything in the immediate range of your arm cannon. This makes enemy encounters more interesting, since you have to get as close to enemies as you can without touching them to maximize your damage output. It's a risk-reward system that integrates naturally into moment-to-moment gameplay. There's a layer of complexity added that keeps combat fresh. Additionally, Metroid Fusion in general just has really high damage values across the board for all enemies. Contact damage especially will quickly melt your health away. This more narrow margin of error means that from the get-go, you have to take even basic enemies more seriously. This is going to vary from person to person, but I feel like some Metroid games are too generous with how forgiving they make enemy encounters. Certain games have nearly every enemy and boss do so little damage that you end up ignoring most attacks because they're such a non-issue as long as you're not playing completely really recklessly. Everyone might have a different idea about where that line of difficulty balancing should be, but I feel like Fusion's combat feels more interesting also because enemies force you to actually pay attention to them. The X-Parasites add new complexities to the combat that further the mechanics of the enemy encounters into something more interesting and dynamic. For one, every enemy defeated now transforms into its gelatinous state and will begin to fly around. These free-floating X must be chased down to restore health and ammo. If you do not collect the X in time, they will reanimate back into a creature, possibly even a new creature. They might even transmutate with another creature to make an even more powerful foe, such as with these Aqua Space Pirates or Skullterras. You gotta maintain mindfulness of everything that the X are doing around you to stay on top of their unique abilities as assimilating shapeshifters. It's really interesting stuff. As far as the enemies themselves are concerned, there are almost no new enemies in Fusion. Nearly every single one is from an older game, but they stay interesting because they are now X-hosts. The X do not assimilate their victims exactly as they were, they adopt new traits and characteristics that make these returning enemies stay fresh and surprising. Some examples include the Bulls, now puffing out damaging smoke when they're damaged. The Kagos now transform into giant towering growths that can be frozen for platforming or shine sparked through for light puzzle solving. Powamps now inflate and block pathways unless carefully frozen from a distance. Yards now quickly hurl spinning projectiles in groups, and Funes now extend out of the walls with massive hidden bodies to ram into you. Fusion is filled with all kinds of new interesting behaviors for returning enemies, and this helps make Fusion's enemy encounters by far the best ones yet. One thing, at least sort of, introduced with Metroid Fusion is new difficulty options. I say sort of because the difficulty options are only in the Japanese version. This would be a huge bummer if it wasn't so easy for me to patch a Japanese ROM into English, but having to jump through these hoops makes difficulty settings needlessly inaccessible to many players. While someone like myself might appreciate Fusion's higher difficulty, it's great to make the game accommodating for a variety of different kinds of players. The difference between the difficulties seems to be mostly just that the enemies deal more or less damage. One big thing that really sticks out to me is that the hard mode reduces the numerical values of expansions. Energy tanks only grant 50 health points compared to the usual 100, and missile tanks only expand your capacity by 2 instead of 5. I think this kind of difficulty balancing needs to be in basically every Metroid game, because this is a natural way to make the game more challenging for players like myself, who want a greater challenge. I've always felt like a total of 250 missiles is just way too high in Metroid games, and I'm glad that Fusion's hard mode allows me to see what playing with a lower capacity feels like. I have always been interested in playing these games with self-imposed challenges like low percent runs or speedrunning to make these games more engaging for veteran players. That's why I like to criticize bosses that, while completely inoffensive in a normal run, can be really frustrating during challenge runs. Challenge runs, at least for me, are a huge part of the Metroid games because they allow me to keep the games interesting even on repeat playthroughs. Fusion's new hard mode helps me even further customize the experience to my liking, and the new easy mode helps others bring the frustration down to a minimum by reducing damage taken, increasing recovery values, and changing certain boss behaviors. Difficulty options should be in every Metroid game, and they only help players tailor the game experience to their liking. So far, my videos have shown that I do not think very highly of the bosses in Metroid games overall, so it's probably not surprising to hear that I think that Fusion's bosses are easily the best ones yet. Early game bosses like Arachnus and Zazaby start off fairly basic to ease you into the mechanics of the combat. All of their attacks feel consistent and dodgeable. They also feature specific vulnerable spots on their bodies to deal damage, like Zazaby's mouth. Ceres is the first boss where I start to feel a bit disappointed from a gameplay perspective, because this guy just zips around at high speeds. There's supposed to be some kind of pattern alternating between the platforms and ceilings every time he passes you to avoid damage, but I can't ever get it down. There's no reason for anyone to suspect that Ceres adheres to any kind of pattern. I only learned about it online. This guy's charging attacks just feel largely unavoidable and unfair. Combine that with how simple he is, and he's my least favorite boss. Both security robot fights are similarly underwhelming to me because it feels way too easy to get this guy into an AI loop. Just pass over him and shoot or avoid his basic projectiles. There is a pattern to be learned here, but the attacks do not evolve and are way too basic to keep me engaged. I could see a newcomer really struggling with the box robot, so there is something to these fights, but they offer almost nothing to the veteran player. I really like that the Barrier Core X is immune to your super missiles. The X just stole your Variasuit data, and the Variasuit is granting the X extra protection. The narrative is synchronized with the gameplay in a lot of ways in Fusion, but even in the little details, the boss is literally using the Variasuit against you by shrugging off super missiles. Unfortunately, that's the only nice thing I have to say about this boss, because it suffers from similar issues to Ceres. There is no screen crunch in Metroid Fusion, but both Ceres and the Barrier Core X feel like they can blindside you from off screen because of how fast they move in with no telegraph. These two guys make low percent runs feel unfair, because there is just no way for you to see their attacks coming. As long as you keep shooting them with charge shots, they shouldn't give you too much of a hard time on a normal playthrough. Yakuza is one of the more interesting fights because it has two phases and keeps tension high. The first phase resembles something like a better spore spawn, in that you are forced to wait for the boss to stop and open its mouth. Between hits, you are using the morph ball and rolling around to minimize the chance that you'll be captured. Like Dragon, getting caught will drain your health quickly and you gotta mash out to free yourself. The second phase is more interesting because Yakuza will start using the space jump to spin around the arena quickly and spit projectiles down on you. The second phase is more chaotic than I'd like, but Yakuza keeps tension high with Fusion's higher damage and makes for one of the more memorable bosses. Nettery is a chorizo statue claimed by the X-parasites and fused with vegetational growths also infected by the X. The X-parasites combine some creatures to make strange amalgamations that feel really freaky, and Nettery is used to spread vegetation throughout Sector 2. Nettery's battle is actually quite similar to the Mother Brain fights from the other Metroid games, as you must carefully platform around and dodge numerous projectiles to focus your damage on a stationary target. Nettery also has a second phase where its head falls off like the chorizo from Super, but now it begins to use the plasma beam to defend itself and block your projectiles. I love this boss for being one of the creepiest in the entire series, but the gameplay is pretty good too. The Nightmare is one of the most beloved bosses in the whole series, and I can't help but find him disappointing. For one, his slowdown mechanic doesn't really add anything interesting to the first phase. It just makes him feel kinda irritating trying to squeeze in underneath him with all this slowdown. When you're shooting his gravity well, he can just decide to move into you and deal lots of damage. It feels like there's not much going on here, but to try to get in close and deal as much damage as you can and hope for the best. Then his second phase has him flying around for a while before seemingly randomly deciding to move slowly to let you get your hits in. Waiting for him to stop chasing you around is irritating because avoiding damage here requires very specific timing with your space jump. He can go for a long time looping the arena. From my experience, your best bet is to just try to avoid him as best as you can and tank a few hits to get him to stop flying around. Ceres and Yakuza may have made a low percent run tedious, but Nightmare makes it straight up not worth it. Actually avoiding damage with this guy is completely ridiculous for no good reason. Learning to avoid his attacks can feel more like AI manipulation than proper telegraph readings, which is exactly what I said about Ridley in Super Metroid. Speaking of Ridley, his fight in this game feels like one of the worst fights in the game again. His patterns are nearly identical to what was found in Super, and I still feel the same way about this fight. He's so much bigger in this arena now, and actually avoiding damage feels close to impossible. Oddly enough, the flare damage combined with the diagonal charged wave beam shots does so much damage that Ridley hardly ends up being much of a challenge at all. It's just so powerful that Ridley manages to both be irritating and easy. The fight against the SAX suffers from a similar issue because the SAX is easy to loop. Every time it lands, release your charge shot, carefully jump away, and you're golden. Even though this fight is kinda simple with the optimal strategy, I still think it's a good boss fight. The actual process of figuring things out, trying different moves like the screw attack or missiles, make this encounter feel tense and memorable. The SAX can do so much damage to you with its beam weapon and screw attack, so even a small slip up is costly here. You really feel like the SAX is on equal playing field here directly through the gameplay, and it makes for a satisfying ending to what the game has been building towards. The final form of the SAX is a cross between that first Hornode and Samus, and it's one of the coolest looking monsters that I have ever seen in a video game. The second phase has so little health that it's over before it begins. I already went over the final boss, and gameplay-wise, there really isn't much to say about it. Like Super's Mother Brain fight, I think we could have received both an interesting boss fight and a fun interactive story scene. So bosses overall in Fusion are some of the best in terms of presentation. I have nothing but good things to say about everything surrounding the gameplay, but some bosses suffer from simplistic AI or unfair attacks. The unfair attacks really aren't going to matter very much unless you're going for some kind of challenge run, but overall, I think the Fusion bosses are pretty good. The best that the series has seen yet for sure, but there is also plenty of room for improvement here. The expansions of Fusion are a lot of fun to search for. Many of them test you in similar ways to the tanks from Super, like observing subtle abnormalities within the environment. Others are out in plain sight to throw the player a bone, but some are outright never hinted to the player. Like I said in the Super Metroid video, I'm more okay with these because of how helpful things like the power bombs and map icons are with locating these. What really makes expansion searching more fun to me in Fusion is the fact that the game will allow you to track your progress on a per level basis. Right on the pause menu, the game will show you this checklist to track your item collection based on the number of tanks in your current level. This feature makes 100%ing these games without a guide finally viable for me, and I cannot praise this inclusion enough. With that said, it is irritating that this item checklist feature is locked behind New Game Plus. In order to have this feature, you have to select New Game from a completed save file. I think it's kind of shitty that this is not available from the get-go, but having it in the game at all makes accounting for your progression by far the best that it's ever been so far. You don't have to beat the game just to know your item percentage, and you don't have to waste time searching levels that you've already picked clean. Item icons on the map also finally change based on whether or not you've already collected the item, which further streamlines collection and cuts down on wasted time. Fusion makes some vast improvements over Super in terms of accounting for your progression, but the pacing of the expansion collecting is unfortunately a step backwards from Super. I praised Super for making most of its expansions available around the halfway point and having very little endgame cleanup. Fusion, by contrast, has a whopping 17 expansions that require endgame backtracking to older levels by my count. 3 tanks require the space jump, 4 require the gravity suit, and 9 require the screw attack. 1 just requires revisiting the restricted zone entrance. Of these 17, 14 of them are powerbomb tanks. Fusion is kind of odd for having a total of 32 powerbomb tanks, which, especially compared to Super's 10, is kinda nuts. Nobody needs 74 power bombs, especially that late in the game when many of them finally become obtainable. As far as the extrinsic reward is concerned, these really don't offer much to the player, and unfortunately the missile tanks don't offer that much either, since the final boss is outright immune to missiles. There are no super missile tanks in this game since supers just replace your missiles. I personally prefer this approach over supers being their own resource since it keeps regular missile tanks valuable into the late game. But Charge Beam is so insanely powerful in this game that it ends up being the definitive choice for many of the encounters. Super was far from balanced, and Fusion still feels like it didn't go far enough in making expansions feel useful in the late game. Especially since so many tanks are only available in the late game, this lessens their extrinsic value significantly. The intrinsic value of searching for the expansions, by contrast, is even better than Super Metroid's expansion hunt. I think that Super has the strong advantage of a much more even pacing, and I can see many preferring it for that reason. But Fusion's expansions test you in a lot of interesting ways. It's a lot of fun searching for secrets and performing challenging tasks like these shine-sparking platforming challenges or these small puzzles with intentionally allowing the X-parasites to transform something in the environment. I also enjoy the challenges that ask you to freeze rippers and perform some tight platforming, or bait this shoot leech into jumping to freeze it into a platform. Fusion's expansions are proper miniature challenges that test you in unique ways, and especially as someone who has been replaying these games for so many years, I always get a kick out of the more advanced techniques and little tricks. Many of the expansions are fun to search for because they also have you pushing into new rooms. It's always satisfying to explore around and push into new territory with your items, even if it's just for expansions. Though Fusion may deliver on this front, I do think it kinda sucks having to do so much of it at the very end. The majority of the expansions are available during your first time through an area, and backtracking to older areas with new items does reward lateral scale item logic. I just think that Fusion puts a bit too much of this at the very end, and fumbles on making this feel extrinsically rewarding. You're allowed to backtrack between missions to older sectors plenty of times in this game, but I feel like 9 tanks requiring the screw attack just feels like too much. These expansions are optional, so it's really not a big deal to most people, but a completionist must be prepared for a bit of an endgame cleanup. So overall, expansions are both a step forward and a step back over Super Metroid. I enjoy counting for my progression in the menu and completing interesting challenges, but the extrinsic value of items is lacking and the pacing of the expansions is uneven. Casual speedrunning in Metroid Fusion never had a chance of living up to the legacy of Super Metroid. The entirely linear item progression and more linear navigation means that optimizing your run doesn't require nearly as much planning or strategy. Fusion speedrunning places focus on precise execution more than optimized routing. There isn't really much for me to say here because it's fairly self-explanatory that Fusion's design goals would have this expected outcome on the speedrunning scene. I'm not saying that it can't be fun because I still very much enjoy trying to go through this game as fast as I can, but things like the unskippable dialogue really weigh on you when trying to just go quickly. Basically, every Metroid game is fun to try to speedrun, and more linear games in general can still offer their own kind of fun with trying to beat them quickly. Speedrunning optimization strategies like sequence breaking and finding the optimal route are much more compatible with the more non-linear games in the series. Fusion's increased linearity makes the experience feel like it's offering less to experiment with by comparison. Less doesn't necessarily mean bad, but I'm not quite as eager to frequently try to lower my final time like I am with some of the other games in the series. One thing that I can credit Fusion speedrunning with is that the extrinsic rewards are the best in the series so far. Instead of Samus stripping down for you when you beat the game quickly like the last 3 games, Fusion goes for an unlockable art gallery. If you beat the game quickly enough, Samus takes her suit off again. Jesus Christ, what alien movie did they do any of this in, you guys? Where are the cool outfits, like Samus's clothes from that one scene in Other M, or fucking anything other than these tonally inconsistent glamour shots? Imagine if you beat Luigi's Mansion with enough money, and the game decided to give you zoomed-in panning shots of Luigi wearing some bikini or something. That'd be just as dumb as it is here. I'm not saying that Samus isn't allowed to be hot or whatever, but this still feels like it at least approaches crossing a line. I'd prefer Nintendo to leave that up to the fans that are into that kind of thing. I know I'm doing a lot of complaining about this, but this isn't a huge deal or whatever. It's just something I personally wish we'd see less of. I'm still disappointed by this lame-ass reward, but I can at least appreciate that the Japanese version offers something actually interesting to me for once. These images were also available to Western players if you linked your copy of Zero Mission to Fusion, and this is how I learned about Samus's past. I know that there's a Japan-only manga that goes over this stuff in much more detail, but I don't really care for the specifics. I kind of prefer when Metroid keeps these things vague, and these gallery images represent somewhat of a paradigm shift for the narrative in the series. It is revealed that Samus was attacked by pirates and Ridley as a child, that some Chozo took her in and raised her. To me, it feels like having Ridley, the Chozo, the Metroids, and Samus all know each other makes the universe feel smaller. Chozo are no longer the mysterious, unnamed ancient civilization that I described in my Metroid NES video, but instead they are the player character's parents. Fusion doesn't tell us much more than that, but I feel like something is already lost by connecting all of these dots. Sometimes merely speculating on a mystery is more fun than actually getting the answers, and I feel like having Ridley in this especially is just going a little too far. I won't discuss the manga itself, but I know that both it and Zero Mission take this issue even further, basically recontextualizing the entire Metroid series. I can enjoy this new lore on its own merits and have fun embracing what Fusion and especially Zero Mission add to the greater mythos, but honestly, I think I still prefer the less is more approach of the previous games, leaving the Chozo as something largely unknown. I'm okay with Fusion's explicit dialogue because it feels like the story of Fusion is cohesive with what came before. But the stuff in the Metroid manga and these gameplay images to a lesser extent feel kinda like it misses the point of why I like Metroid's lore in the first place. I don't want to spend too much time on this topic since it's well beyond the scope of this video, but I do want to say that all of this started with Metroid Fusion's art gallery. This new lore is still great stuff, but it kind of erases the mystery and makes a lot of what the early games do feel less special to me. Metroid Fusion's greatest enemy is a close-minded player. I already said this about Metroid 2 in an older video, but people often justify Metroid Fusion's increased and undisguised linearity by pointing out that the gameplay better suits a handheld device. I do agree with this, but I take this a step further and say that any Metroid game could and should be more linear if it wants to be. I don't think we need excuses like portability to justify a more linear experience. As long as a Metroid game is playing to the strengths of its more linear design, then I'm in full support of these games releasing alongside the more non-linear entries. Metroid games pride themselves on being varied and unique experiences. I think no game in this series demonstrates this better than Metroid Fusion. It's not just that it's different, it's that this game manages to stand toe-to-toe with even Super Metroid as one of the greatest games in the series. If Super Metroid synergizes its design aspects to offer an immersive gameplay experience driven by player agency, then Metroid Fusion does the same thing for its terrifying atmosphere and incredible gameplay story experience. Instead of being angry that this isn't the same Metroid formula I'm familiar with, I'm appreciating things like its incredible strengths and its tight-focused gameplay, excellent pacing, fantastic story, balanced difficulty curve, tense and haunting atmosphere, and focus on exploring the characters and factions of the Metroid universe. The game does lose its more open-ended map design on a larger scale, which it's far from the only Metroid game to be guilty of. There are certainly plenty of expectedly negative consequences to this new approach, such as the relative lack of player-driven exploration, no sequence breaking, less item progression, frequent navigational restrictions, and a more segmented world. Metroid Fusion even stumbles a few minor things in its execution as well, such as the unskippable dialogue, a couple of underwhelming bosses, poorly paced 100% collection, and somewhat unbalanced weapons. There are certainly plenty of valid reasons for players to take issues with many aspects of Fusion's design, but Fusion overall more than justifies this deviation from the norm. Exploring within one of Fusion's sectors with an objective marker isn't the same as games like Super, but different is all I can call it. I recognize that this is a matter of preference. As a fan of franchises like Resident Evil, The Legend of Zelda, and Sonic the Hedgehog, I have learned that a series of games can be far more diverse than a single idea. The game doesn't merely resemble Metroid on a surface level, but actively recontextualizes the entire mythos of the series. Metroid Fusion is a completely unforgettable experience, and I think it is based.